The air in Dallas on November 22, 1963, still tasted of gunpowder and disbelief. The story you think you know begins and ends on a single stretch of road, with the echo of a rifle shot and the frantic race of a presidential limousine toward Parkland Hospital. The world's eyes were locked on that car, on the blur of pink and the crimson stain that would forever define a decade. We have been shown those frames thousands of times, analyzed them from every angle, debated every shadow. But what if that was exactly the point? What if the most televised tragedy in human history was in fact the greatest misdirection ever conceived? While the world fixated on Elm Street, a different kind of history was unfolding just out of sight, behind the quiet wooden stockade fence on the grassy knoll. Away from the screaming crowds and the clicking cameras, in the dusty railway yard that backed onto the plaza, the atmosphere wasn't one of panic. It was one of quiet, unnerving efficiency. According to a handful of witness statements that were later buried, dismissed, or mysteriously altered in official transcripts, a vehicle was waiting there. It wasn't a police car, it wasn't a Secret Service follow-up, it was an ambulance, but not one belonging to any local hospital or service. It was unmarked, sterile white, its windows tinted impossibly dark. As chaos erupted on the street below, a small group of men, dressed not in official uniforms but in inconspicuous dark suits, moved with a purpose that stood in stark contrast to the surrounding pandemonium. They didn't run, they didn't shout. They executed a plan. Obscured by the trees and the crest of the hill, they converged on this strange, ghost-like vehicle. There was a flurry of coordinated movement, a door sliding open and shut with a heavy, final thud. Then, without a siren, without a single flashing light, the unmarked ambulance pulled away. It didn't race toward the nearest hospital. It slipped into a forgotten service road, melted into the city's sprawling grid of overpasses and back streets, and simply vanished. Not a single frame of film captured its existence. Not a single mention of it can be found in the Warren Commission's 26 volumes of evidence. It is a phantom, a ghost in the machine of official history. For decades, researchers have been led to chase lone gunmen and magic bullets, to argue over trajectories and timelines, all while the real event was being scrubbed from the record. They wanted you to look at the limousine. They needed you to look at the limousine. Because while the world was mourning a death, the men in the shadows were managing a disappearance. We have been asking the wrong question for more than half a century. The question isn't who killed the president. The question is, where did he go? To understand the why, you must first forget the man you think you knew. The world saw John F. Kennedy as the personification of vigor, the embodiment of a new, youthful America. They saw the confident stride, the easy smile, the shock of hair catching the wind as he sailed off the coast of Hyannisport. This was the king of Camelot, a figure of seemingly inexhaustible energy and effortless grace. The public was told of his wartime heroism, of his back pain, of a manageable condition called Addison's disease. These were presented as the honorable scars of a life lived to the fullest, minor footnotes in the biography of a giant. But this narrative, like the one crafted for Dallas, was a beautiful, meticulously maintained lie. It was a cover story, not for weakness, but for a secret so profound it had the power to destabilize the entire Western world. The truth was never meant to see the light of day. It was buried in documents that technically do not exist, in medical charts written in code, and in the memories of a handful of people who took their oath of silence to the grave. But fragments of the truth always survive. A private journal, said to have belonged to a senior physician within the president's innermost circle, has recently surfaced, passed down through a family who understood its gravity, but not its full meaning. The leather-bound book is filled with cryptic notes, chemical formulas, and observations dated from late 1962 through the autumn of 1963. It does not describe a man managing chronic but stable conditions. It describes a man in a desperate, losing battle against his own body. In an entry dated October 9, 1962, just days before the world would hold its breath during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the physician wrote, "The progression is faster than we feared. The cellular breakdown is accelerating. The pain management is becoming less effective. But it's the neurological symptoms that are our greatest terror. He hides it well, but the tremors have begun. The diagnosis is no longer deniable, a variant of accelerated cellular degeneration, aggressive and untreatable. Our most optimistic projection, barring a miracle, is 1 year, maybe less." This was not Addison's. This was not back pain. This was a death sentence, a catastrophic failure of the body's most basic functions. The disease threatened not just his life, but his mind, the very mind that held the nuclear codes and the fate of the planet. The daily cocktail of amphetamines, steroids, and painkillers that the world vaguely knew about was not for a bad back. It was an unprecedented chemical dam holding back a tidal wave. A small, fiercely loyal medical team worked around the clock, not to cure him, but simply to keep the mask of vitality from slipping. They were engaged in a high-stakes performance, enabling the president to appear strong and decisive on the world stage, while, behind the closed doors of the Oval Office, he was enduring an agony no one could comprehend. The public saw a leader with a healthy tan. A handful of insiders saw the jaundice being masked by medication. The public heard a powerful orator. The physician's journal describes episodes of slurred speech and memory lapses, battled back from the brink by sheer force of will and a carefully calibrated dose of stimulants just moments before stepping up to a podium. Think of the implications. At the absolute zenith of the Cold War, the leader of the free world was secretly and rapidly dying. What would have happened if Nikita Khrushchev had known? What would his political enemies at home have done with such information? The president's health was not a personal matter. It was a matter of supreme national security. A public decline was unthinkable. It would have triggered a crisis of confidence that could have shattered alliances and invited aggression. The presidency could not be seen to falter, to weaken, to die slowly. The situation was unsustainable. A solution was needed, but no conventional solution existed. When the most powerful man on Earth is faced with an unavoidable end, and the world cannot be allowed to see it, the search begins for an answer that lies beyond the limits of known science and beyond the boundaries of accepted morality. In the highest echelons of power, there exists a truth rarely spoken aloud. The democratically elected government is a facade. It is the grand public-facing stage upon which the drama of politics plays out for the masses. But behind the curtain, in the deep, quiet wings, the real directors pull the strings. They are not elected. They have no official titles. They are a collection of men who represent the true, permanent foundation of American power. They were known, in the most secret of circles, only as the Prometheus Council. This was not a committee or a department. It was a convergence of dynastic wealth, generational military authority, and paradigm-shifting scientific intellect. Imagine a room, not in the White House, but perhaps in the oak-paneled library of a secluded Virginia estate, or deep within the shielded subterranean levels of a national laboratory. In this room sits the industrialist who commands a manufacturing empire so vast that his corporate budget rivals that of a small nation. Beside him is the four-star general who doesn't just command armies, but who thinks in terms of decades and continents, viewing the Cold War not as a struggle of ideologies, but as a global chess match for resources and control. And across from them, the physicist, a man who had looked into the heart of the atom, and whose mind contained the blueprints for technologies the public could not even dream of. These were the architects of the post-war world, the silent partners behind the Manhattan Project, the Marshall Plan, and the burgeoning space race. They operated on a plane of existence far above the messy fray of party politics, funded by black budgets and the unspoken tides of the military-industrial complex. Their sole unifying creed was the absolute, unwavering preservation of American dominance, and their mandate was to achieve it by any means necessary. For the Prometheus Council, the presidency was an instrument, a tool to be wielded. The man in the office was a temporary custodian, valuable only insofar as he served the long-term strategic interest. And John F. Kennedy was, for a time, the perfect instrument. He was charismatic, inspiring, and possessed a brilliant, cold-blooded strategic mind that he hid behind a warm public persona. He was an asset, but when their unparalleled intelligence network, a web of influence that reached into every corner of the government, including the president's own sealed medical files, delivered the devastating prognosis, the council did not see a human tragedy. They saw a critical systems failure. Their greatest asset was on a countdown to catastrophic collapse. His rapid physical and neurological decline posed an existential threat. The potential for a power vacuum, for a visible weakening of American leadership at the height of global tension, was a variable they could not accept. The council convened not to mourn, but to problem solve. Standard protocol, a seamless transition of power to the vice president, was deemed insufficient. Johnson was a known quantity, a master politician, but he was not Kennedy. He lacked the unique combination of public adoration and private ruthlessness that the council had found so useful. They believed Kennedy's mind, his experience from the brink of nuclear war, his very essence as a symbol of American strength, was a resource too precious to be simply lost to the random cruelty of biology. In their cold, pragmatic calculus, the man himself was secondary to his function, and if the body was failing, then the function had to be preserved in a new way. The problem was not how to prepare for the president's death. The problem was how to prevent it from disrupting their grand design. It was a challenge worthy of their name. They had stolen fire from the gods before at Trinity. Now, confronted with the mortality of their most important asset, they began to draw up the plans for an even more audacious theft, the theft of a man from time itself. The meeting was not recorded in any official White House log. It took place in the dead of night, not in the stately Oval Office, but in a small, soundproofed study in the private residence, a room so secure that its existence was known to fewer than 5 people. The air was thick with the scent of old leather and the unspoken gravity of the moment. President Kennedy sat behind a simple wooden desk, the lamplight carving deep shadows onto his face, making him look older and more weary than the world had ever seen him. A slight, almost imperceptible tremor in his left hand was the only outward sign of the storm raging within his body. Across from him sat 2 men who embodied the Prometheus Council, the general, with a face that seemed carved from granite, and the scientist, a man whose quiet demeanor belied a mind that held the keys to creation and destruction. There were no pleasantries. The scientist began, his voice calm and unnervingly devoid of emotion. He laid out the medical facts not as a doctor would, with sympathy, but as an engineer would, outlining a series of systemic failures. He spoke of mitochondrial decay, of synaptic misfirings, of a cascade of cellular self-destruction for which modern science had no answer. He confirmed the secret diagnosis, using its clinical, terrifying name, and gave the president the same timeline his own physician had secretly recorded, 1 year, perhaps less. He let the finality of the sentence hang in the silent room. Then, he slid a single, impossibly thin folio across the desk. It was bound not in leather, but in a strange metallic-looking material that seemed to drink the light. There is, however, the scientist continued, his tone shifting from clinical to conspiratorial, another option, one that lies outside the realm of conventional medicine, outside the realm of publicly acknowledged science. He called it the Prometheus Protocol. He spoke of biostasis, of a state of suspended animation so profound it bordered on the metaphysical. It was not freezing, he explained. Freezing was crude, destructive. This was different. This was a process of arresting life at the quantum level. Every cell, every atom, every electrical impulse in his brain would be halted in its exact state, shielded from the ravages of time and disease by a cryogenic field of near absolute zero. The technology, he hinted with a deliberate lack of detail, was not entirely of human origin. It was the result of decades of secret analysis, a reverse engineering of an asset recovered from the New Mexico desert in 1947. An asset that had proven that biology, even mortality itself, was just another system that could be hacked. This was the offer. Not a cure, but a pause. A chance to step out of time. They would place him in this state of cryogenic sleep, entombing him in a secret purpose-built facility until a future date when medical science had evolved to a point where his degenerative condition could not only be halted, but fully reversed. He would awaken into a future where he could be made whole again. The price for this miracle was absolute. He would have to die. To his family, to his country, to the entire world, John F. Kennedy must perish. The presidency would pass to Johnson. History would record his assassination. His legacy would be sealed in martyrdom. He would have to vanish completely, surrendering the life he knew, the wife he loved, the children he adored, for the mere promise of a future existence. It was a Faustian bargain of unimaginable proportions. The president stared at the 2 men, his mind reeling. It was the stuff of cheap fiction, a madman's fantasy, but the look in their eyes was not madness. It was the cold, hard certainty of men who did not deal in hypotheticals. The general spoke for the first time, his voice a low rumble. Mr. President, your mind, your experience in the crisis, your leadership, these are not your own. They are assets of the United States of America. We have a duty to preserve those assets. We cannot, and will not, allow them to be erased by a biological accident. He framed it not as a choice for his survival, but as his ultimate patriotic duty, a sacrifice far greater than the one he made in the South Pacific. He would become a ghost, a secret king awaiting a call that might never come, all to safeguard a future he would never know. The offer of eternity was on the table, a chilling, seductive whisper in the silent room. Once the President of the United States agreed to die, the abstract theory of the Prometheus Council hardened into a chillingly concrete operational plan. His reluctant, whispered yes in the dead of night was the starting pistol for a machine that had been waiting, dormant, for just such a command. The project was given a codename, one that would never appear on any official document, but was spoken of in hushed tones in the deepest vaults of the national security state, the Dallas Gambit. It was a name that perfectly encapsulated the strategy, a calculated sacrifice of the most powerful piece on the board to achieve an unassailable victory. The first and most crucial element was the creation of a shadow, a figure destined to take the blame and absorb the world's fury. The Council's architects of human intelligence scanned their warped, invisible ledgers and found the perfect instrument, a former Marine named Lee Harvey Oswald. He was not a random malcontent. His entire life, viewed through the lens of the Gambit, reads like a meticulously crafted resume for a scapegoat, a trained sharpshooter with a history of insubordination, a supposed defector to the Soviet Union who was, inexplicably, allowed to return to the United States with no consequences, a man who loudly championed the cause of Castro's Cuba while having connections to vehemently anti-Castro elements. He was a living contradiction, a ghost in the intelligence machine who left a trail of conflicting evidence wherever he went. The Council did not recruit him, they simply moved him. They maneuvered him into a job at the Texas School Book Depository, a building that they had already selected as the perfect sniper's perch. Oswald was the ideal patsy, precisely because his story would never quite add up, ensuring that investigators would spend generations chasing their tails through a labyrinth of his life, never once stumbling upon the truth. Next was the selection of the stage itself, Dealey Plaza. To the public, it was just a downtown intersection. To the architects of the Gambit, it was a perfectly designed kill box, but one designed for confusion, not for a clean kill. The route of the motorcade, published well in advance, included a slow, sharp 120-degree turn onto Elm Street. This turn would force the presidential limousine to decelerate to a crawl, making it an easy, theatrical target. The plaza itself is an acoustic nightmare, a bowl of concrete and grass flanked by buildings and a triple underpass that would bounce the sound of a rifle shot into a dozen different directions, creating instant and total confusion about its origin. Witnesses would hear shots from the depository, from the grassy knoll, from the overpass, everywhere and nowhere at once. And then there was the knoll itself. The grassy slope with its wooden stockade fence was a masterpiece of stage design. It provided a perfect shadowy vantage point for a second shooter that would cement the idea of a conspiracy in the public mind for decades, adding another layer of misdirection. But its true purpose was far more practical. It offered a concealed backstage area, a blind spot from the street, with a direct unseen path to the railway yards behind it, the perfect route for an extraction. The entire geography of Dealey Plaza was chosen not to ensure a successful assassination, but to ensure a successful performance. Every detail that has been endlessly debated as a security lapse was, in fact, a deliberate stage direction. The Secret Service agents who were uncharacteristically ordered to stand down from their positions on the rear of the presidential limousine, they were cleared to provide an unobstructed view for the world's cameras and an unobstructed path for the assailant. The decision to remove the limousine's protective bubble top, despite the overcast sky and threat of rain, it was done to ensure the star of the show was fully visible to his audience. The plan was audacious, it was monstrous, but it was also brilliant. It weaponized the public's attention, turning the very act of witnessing the event into a form of mass hypnosis. While the world watched the manufactured death of a king, the real man was being spirited away, his escape covered by the smoke and mirrors of a national trauma. For 60 years, the grassy knoll has been the dark heart of the mystery, a piece of hallowed ground for conspiracists and the source of 1,000 unanswered questions. The official narrative would have you believe it was a place of shadows and specters, perhaps the hiding spot of a second, or even a third, phantom gunman. We have been conditioned to imagine a man in the shadows, leveling a rifle, his face obscured by a puff of smoke. But the truth is infinitely more profound, and far more chilling. The most important man on the grassy knoll that day was not holding a rifle. He was waiting for a signal. He was the ghost in the photographs, the figure glimpsed for a fleeting second in the Zapruder film, a man in a dark suit, standing near the corner of the stockade fence. He did not flinch when the shots rang out. He did not run for cover. Instead, as the first crack echoed through the plaza, he calmly raised a small, dark object to his lips and spoke a single, inaudible word. It was not a weapon he held, but a communication device. He was not an assassin. He was the conductor, and the rifle shot was merely the downbeat of his symphony. He was the leader of the extraction team. The most damning evidence of this comes not from an anonymous source or a deathbed confession, but from a formal statement given to the Dallas County Sheriff's Office within 2 hours of the event. It was the testimony of a veteran switchman, a man named Harlan Bell, who spent his days in the railway control tower overlooking the entire northern side of Dealey Plaza. His vantage point gave him a clear, unobstructed view of the parking lot and the railway yards behind the grassy knoll, the very area hidden from every camera on Elm Street. In his initial terrified statement, Bell described the strange activity he had witnessed all morning, the quiet arrival of several men in dark identical suits who milled about the parking lot with no apparent purpose, and the presence of the stark white, unmarked ambulance parked discreetly behind a row of hedges. When the motorcade chaos erupted, Bell's attention was drawn not to the street, but to the sudden, purposeful movement behind the fence. He saw the man with the communication device give a sharp, decisive nod. Instantly, 2 other men emerged from behind the corner of the stockade fence. They were not running, they were moving swiftly, supporting a third man between them. This third man was the secret. According to Bell's statement, he was pale, unsteady on his feet, and his head was slumped forward, but he was unmistakably wearing the same dark suit as the president. As they hustled him toward the waiting ambulance, his head lifted for a moment, and Bell swore he saw the same familiar face, the same shock of chestnut hair. But it was a face devoid of its famous vitality, a face etched with pain and exhaustion, the face of the man from the secret medical journals, not the king of Camelot. Bell watched, mesmerized, as they reached the ambulance. The door slid open, the figure was bundled inside with an almost medical gentleness, and the door slammed shut. The man in charge, the conductor, took one last look around the empty yard, then climbed into the passenger seat. The vehicle started without a sound and drove away, not with the urgency of an escape, but with the chilling calm of a departure. Harlan Bell had just witnessed the President of the United States vanish into thin air. When the FBI took over the investigation, Bell's testimony was revisited. His detailed 4-page statement to the sheriff was condensed into a single paragraph in the Warren Commission's files. The unmarked ambulance became a station wagon of indeterminate color. The man resembling the president became an unknown male. His incredible observation was systematically dismantled, discredited, and buried. The man on the grassy knoll was not a shooter. He was a shepherd, and on November 22, 1963, he guided his most precious asset off the world stage, leaving behind only a ghost and a trail of lies. The unmarked ambulance did not speed. It moved with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a vehicle that knows no red lights can stop it, that knows no police officer would dare to pull it over. Inside, the world was silent. The chaos of Dealey Plaza was a distant, muffled memory, replaced by the low, steady hum of advanced medical equipment. The president was not lying on a gurney, bleeding. He was sitting upright, strapped into a clinical, metallic chair. The debilitating pain that had been his constant companion for months was gone, erased by a powerful but clear-headed sedative administered by the silent men in suits who sat opposite him. He was lucid. He was a passenger on his own journey into oblivion. Their destination was a disused military airfield on the desolate outskirts of Dallas, a place scrubbed from all but the most classified maps. There, waiting on the cracked tarmac under the gray November sky, was a jet unlike any other. It bore no markings, no flag, no serial number. It was a sterile, shark gray specter, its engines already whining in the gloom. The transfer was swift, silent, and precise. The President of the United States walked his last steps in the open air and ascended the ramp into the belly of the ghost plane. As the door sealed, he was no longer a public figure. He was cargo. The flight was long, conducted at an extreme altitude that rendered it invisible to commercial radar. The windows remained opaque. Hours later, the plane began its descent, landing not on a runway, but on a vast, featureless slab of concrete in the heart of the Nevada desert, miles from any known road or settlement. As the engines spooled down, a section of the slab itself retracted into the earth, revealing a cavernous, brilliantly lit shaft descending into the planet's crust. The aircraft was lowered on a massive platform, deep into the subterranean darkness. He had arrived at Avalon. The facility was a testament to the Prometheus Council's limitless power and paranoia. It was not a bunker. It was a self-contained world carved from bedrock, powered by a small, experimental thorium reactor that could run for a century without refueling. The air was cold, dry, and smelled of ozone and filtered sterility. There were no corridors, only vast, echoing chambers connected by silent, magnetically levitating trams. The walls were not concrete, but a polished, obsidian-like material that absorbed all sound. Before the final procedure, he was taken to one last room. It was small, Spartan, containing only a single chair facing a large screen. One of the handlers, breaking his silence for the first time, spoke in a monotone. "You have 5 minutes." The screen flickered to life. It was a live feed, a direct secret tap into a camera hidden in the private quarters of the White House. On the screen, he saw his wife. She was not the stoic, graceful figure the world was seeing. She was shattered, being comforted by his brother. He saw his children, too young to understand, being shielded from the storm of grief that had engulfed their home. They were ghosts to him now, living in a world he had just departed. They could not see him. They could not hear him. He was already a phantom, watching his own wake. He spoke their names, his voice cracking in the sterile silence. He whispered a final, unheard goodbye to the flickering images on the screen, a heart-wrenching monologue delivered to an audience that would never know he was watching. Then, it was time. He was led into the final chamber, a cavernous, cathedral-like space. In the exact center, resting on a dais, was the pod. It was a masterpiece of alien-seeming engineering, sculpted from the same seamless, metallic material as the folio he had been shown in his study. It was not a bed, it was an altar. The scientist was there, flanked by technicians in sterile white suits. The president laid down. He felt no fear, only a probing, soul-deep weariness. As a clear, vapor-like gas filled the pod, a deep, penetrating cold began to spread through him. Not the harsh bite of ice, but a gentle, absolute stillness. His last conscious thought was of his son saluting his flag-draped casket, a future he had orchestrated but would never see. The frosted canopy descended, sealing him in. A technician made a final entry in a digital log. The mission codename, Avalon. The subject's new designation, the Winter King. The King of Camelot was gone. In his place was a secret, sleeping in a subterranean tomb, a silent king in a frozen kingdom, waiting for a spring that might never arrive. With the president secured in his timeless tomb, the second and perhaps most complex phase of the Prometheus Council's plan began, the Great Erasure. The goal was not simply to sell a lie to the American public, but to construct an entirely new reality, a version of history so robust and all-encompassing that it would smother the truth for all time. It required a level of manipulation and control that went far beyond a simple cover-up. It was the systematic, deliberate rewriting of a moment in time. The first instrument of this grand deception was the Warren Commission. To the world, it was presented as the highest authority in the land, a panel of unimpeachable statesmen and legal minds convened to deliver the definitive truth to a grieving nation. In reality, it was the greatest piece of political theater ever staged. The members were carefully chosen. Some were witting accomplices, bound by oaths to the council, while others were honorable but naive patriots who were skillfully guided and fed a curated stream of information. The commission's true purpose was not to investigate a crime, but to author a script. Their final 26-volume report was not an analysis, it was a weapon. Its immense size and suffocating detail were designed to be intellectually impenetrable, a labyrinth of minutiae where any genuine investigator would become hopelessly lost. The single-bullet theory, a proposition of such physical absurdity, was the masterpiece of the entire exercise, a deliberately flawed and endlessly debatable concept that would act as a black hole, sucking all critical energy and focus into its vortex for decades to come. While the commission provided the public face of the operation, the dirty work fell to the one man in America who understood the power of secrets better than anyone, J. Edgar Hoover. The director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation was the Council's enforcer, the master cleaner for the Dallas Gambit. He unleashed his army of agents not to solve a murder, but to sanitize a reality. Witnesses who saw too much, like the railway man Harlan Bell, received quiet, unofficial visits. Their initial frantic statements were lost or damaged. New, cleaner versions were typed up, correcting the hysterical errors of the originals. Men like Bell, who had seen an impossible truth, were gently but firmly reminded of their government pensions, of their children's futures, of how easily a man's life could become complicated. It wasn't blackmail, it was a quiet, soul-crushing realignment of their memory. Evidence that contradicted the official narrative, photographs, sound recordings, inconvenient autopsy notes, simply vanished from secure evidence lockers, replaced by forgeries or declared non-existent. Hoover's FBI moved like a ghost through the investigation, meticulously erasing every footprint that led away from their chosen patsy, Oswald. The Great Erasure, however, did not end in 1964. The Prometheus Council understood that a secret of this magnitude could not be held by force alone. It had to be managed. This led to the most brilliant phase of the entire operation, the controlled release. Over the subsequent decades, the Council, through its silent influence over the National Archives and intelligence agencies, began the slow, theatrical drip of declassified JFK files. This was a psychological operation of breathtaking genius. Each release, filled with heavily redacted pages and tantalizing but ultimately meaningless clues, was designed to feed the burgeoning community of researchers. They were given just enough rope to hang themselves, pointed toward intricate but false conspiracies involving the Mafia, the Cubans, rogue CIA agents. Anything and everything to keep their brilliant minds occupied and their eyes pointed in the wrong direction. The files were a smokescreen of manufactured complexity. They kept the world arguing about whether there were 3 shots or 4, when the real secret was that the most important event hadn't involved a bullet at all. The constant promise of a final truth hidden in the next batch of documents became a perpetual motion machine of misdirection. The Council had created a self-sustaining ecosystem of conspiracy that protected the core secret by surrounding it with a universe of smaller, more believable lies. The Great Erasure was complete. They had not just hidden the truth of the president's disappearance, they had made the very concept so unthinkable, so buried beneath a mountain of official lies and unofficial speculation, that even if the door to Avalon were thrown open today, the world would likely refuse to believe what came out. And so, the story ends. Or does it? For more than 60 years, the world has mourned a martyr. We have carved his profile onto our coins, named our airports and space centers in his honor, and lit an eternal flame that flickers as a symbol of a promise cut short. His death became the defining myth of modern America, a moment of lost innocence from which the nation has never fully recovered. But this entire legacy, every tear shed, every monument built, is a monument to a ghost. It is a grand memorial to an event that never happened. The man we mourn is not dead. He is simply waiting. This truth reframes everything we think we know about the history that followed. Every major event of the last half-century must be viewed through a new, terrifying lens. Was the prolonged agony of the Vietnam War allowed to escalate because the steady hand of the Prometheus Council preferred a nation distracted by a foreign conflict? Was the fall of Richard Nixon, a man who famously sought to expose the secrets of his predecessors, not the work of investigative journalists, but a quiet internal coup by the keepers of Avalon, removing a threat to their ultimate secret? Every presidency, every election, every crisis has been managed under the shadow of this one monumental fact: that the true, legitimate leader was in a state of suspended animation, a king in waiting, held in reserve by a cabal of unelected and invisible rulers. History since 1963 has not been a series of chaotic events. It has been an interregnum, a carefully managed holding pattern. The question, then, is not what happened in the past, but what is happening now. Is the Winter King still sleeping beneath the Nevada desert? Did the technology work, or did it fail, leaving the Council to guard an empty tomb? Recent whispers from the fringes of the satellite intelligence community speak of inexplicable energy signatures, massive, short-lived power spikes emanating from a dead zone deep within the Nellis Air Force Range, a zone whose airspace was suddenly and inexplicably reclassified to a level of secrecy reserved for only the most critical national security assets. Are they simply maintaining the facility, or are they preparing to awaken him? Has the cure for his ailment finally been perfected in the secret laboratories of the 21st century? This possibility unleashes a cascade of questions that are almost too frightening to contemplate. If he were to return, a man from a simpler black and white world thrust into our chaotic digital age, what would he see? Would he be a savior, a voice of lost reason? Or would his mind, unprepared for the future, simply shatter? What would his return do to the very fabric of our society? The legitimacy of every president since Johnson would evaporate overnight. Our political system would collapse. It would be an event more disruptive than any war, any revolution in human history. But the most important question is the final one. Who are the guardians of the secret now? The original members of the Prometheus Council are long gone. Have they passed their sacred duty down to their children and their protégés? Is there a new council, a new generation of silent rulers who hold the fate of the Winter King in their hands? And if they have held this one earth-shattering secret for more than half a century, what other truths have they buried? What other lies are we living? The ultimate conspiracy is not that they faked the death of a president. It's that they prove they have the power to control reality itself. The story of John F. Kennedy did not end in a hail of gunfire in Dallas. That was only the end of the first act. And we, all of us, are now living in the terrifying, silent pause before the curtain rises on the last.